Also economic angle. So I will work on it.
Okay.
They did that. I saw your tweet, but I only got a message from yeah, I didn't get any. Yeah, I only got one. Yeah. Luckily, the toilet was empty. Luckily, the toilet was empty. Let's continue. This room is so cold. All right, let's continue. Wait, I drink water. Yeah, like just now, like what Gabriel asked me about the effectiveness of the organization, right? Just want to emphasize to you, yeah, remember, for both OAU and AU, we do make a lot of emphasis on, how it is less than effective, right? But please make sure you also balance out the argument, right? By ensuring that you do have at least one paragraph, right? One condensed paragraph about some of its contributions, the positive aspect of it, and so on, right? Otherwise, I find that the answer is very unbalanced, right? I do notice this either way with a lot of other topics, like how students take a very one-sided view of, say, NATO, or take a one-sided view of EU and so on, right? Cannot afford to do that, right? Because it just throws off the entire it throws off the entire discussion, right? Same thing with IMF and World Bank also, right? I tend to notice this pattern. So any kind of organization, right, that tends to or seems to have a lot of negative aspects, or there's a lot of arguments that you can make in relation to the critique, right? Please make sure you balance it out, right? At least one paragraph that summarizes, like a transitional paragraph, maybe like functioning similar, like how you would craft like a counter argument, right? Same approach to it, right? It must be there, okay? So even if you're tempted to just be cynical and whack the organization, which a lot of students tend to be a bit more cynical about, like you're funding, you've got an organization that's lasting for so many years. How come you haven't been able to get your act together? Kind of a logic, right? But the balance still must be there. Asking you to cop out. Sorry, this is another issue. Now that I mentioned it, right? This is another issue. Students come back and say that, oh, if I have arguments that talk about both the positive contributions or the positive aspect related to it, and then as well as a negative aspect, then is it a cop out? Does it sound like as if I'm sitting on the fence, right? I would say no. It doesn't sound like you're sitting on the fence, or that is a cop out. If you balance the argument in such a way to say that the negatives of the organization outweigh the positives, right? So the negative aspect outweigh the positive. So that means what you need to do, right, is in providing. I want to remind you this. All right, okay. When you are providing both the negative aspect and the positive aspect, there must be an explicit sentence or phrase or something in your exam answer that says, that this is a scenario where the negative contributions of the organization outweigh the positive contributions, and then you go on to discuss it. Please do not write in a way that is you're assuming that the marker can identify what your angle is, right, based on like how much you have written, right? That means so the students may assume, right, I have written more on the negative aspect, so the marker should understand, right, that my overall take is that this organization is less than successful. You understand what I mean? All right. I noticed that these explicit statements are often missing from a lot of exam answers, right? And surprisingly enough, even with the level two, right, this is level two course, right? Even with the level two, answers, right, I find that this is not explicit enough. They don't come out right and say thesis statement not clear, right? I'm reminding you about this. Why? Because we're at lecture 18 already. 19, 20, All right, 19 and 20 is ICTR, ICTR, ICC. 20, 21 is, overall conclusion, summary, and then you go out for your prelims. I basically got 3 more sessions with you to nag at you about this, right? Until your mock exams, until your prelim exams, right? Then after that, I will need you for the revisions later on only. So, as you're gearing up, I assume that you're already, thinking about how to start revising and so on. Take advantage of the prelims, I do notice that students who go for the prelims, let me just nag about this a little bit. Students who go for the prelims, right? It preps you. It shocks you if you haven't prepared, right? It shocks you into thinking these are the areas that I realize that I'm not, well versed in enough, or these are the gaps in knowledge. That's what, if you do not have time to finish revising the whole syllabus, I understand that. I do understand that, which is why a lot of students only do like 1 question or 2 questions for the prelim. Some will do all 3, right? But at any rate, it's a stark reminder, right? And also because we've had online lessons, and then we've only had the last couple of lessons in person and so on, right? So getting into the gear of everything, right? So I highly recommend that you do go for the prelims, right? At least try out at least 1 question, at least have the experience of looking at the paper and so on. Okay. Second thing, I don't know. Did anybody get any kind of message or email or anything or forum notification regarding your final exams so far? Or they have confirmed that it's online, is it? Okay, because I got one for my foundation class. I did not get one for the EMFSS, so I got one that is online. So online, but they didn't mention that it's proctored or there's Zoom invigilation or anything so far. But from what I read from the other email for my foundation class is that they will release some more details relating to this subsequently. Yes, right. Okay, all right. Okay, can. Okay, can y'all do me a favor? If y'all do get any kind of forum thing or whatever, just forward it to me. Somebody, just anybody, just forward it to me. Because somehow I'm only getting like 1. I didn't get the other one unless I'm not I'm subscribed to the forum, so I don't know why I didn't get it. Anyway, yeah, so it's online, so all happy lah. I shall not say anything further relating to this. Yeah, online, all happy lah, all of y'all lah. Okay, but I would still say this, right? Don't be too elated at this point, because they may say online, but I give you 4 hours, or online I give you 6 hours, right? And that would still severely impact if you're going to be flipping. I mean, look at the lecture notes and the subject guide, and the cants, links, and styles and everything, right? If you don't prep for the online exam adequately, right, you are going to be flipping, and wasting your time and only frustrating yourself. You do not want to be frustrated during an exam, right? Okay, so take my advice. Try your, if it's an online exam, then you need to work towards organizing your notes very well. All right, okay. I took one online exam in my life, and I didn't like it. All right, I basically chucked the book under the table, and I not online exam, open book exam. I chucked the book under the table and I just wrote, without looking at the text, right? Because it was taking too much time. Okay, so you have to think about organizing your notes very well now. Okay, think about what kind of questions you want to do, and think about organization of the material, right? And I, like I said, certain things you can prep, right? Prepare certain paragraphs. Please be very careful about plagiarism. All right, please be extremely careful. If you think that you're lifting something from the lecture notes, right? Because when I do the lecture notes, I do amend here and there. As in, I don't entirely lift chunks, from the subject guide or from the cants, links, and stuff. But I can't tell you exactly, what I tweaked and so on, right? So adjust the phrasing a little bit. When in doubt, if you think it sounds too sophisticated, it sounds like it's straight out from a textbook, please put it in quotes. Please do not get yourself into trouble for no reason, right? Because then that complicates your, especially if you're if you're level 3, you're graduating and so on, right? You do not want your results, to be held back on the. I think Gabriel, you're graduating, right? Yeah, yeah. So some of y'all, those who are in level 3, please think carefully about this. A lot of students come back and say, I didn't plagiarize, right? But I've been called out for plagiarism, so please be very careful about this. You don't get the Turnitin score, right, when you submit into the portal. Yeah, so you would know. You won't know. You see, that's the problem down here. You don't know. You won't know, right? So please be very careful about that. Why I'm saying this now is that when you're preparing your notes, then you should indicate in your note preparation for your revision, right? Where is the material from? So that you can just put in brackets or put at the bottom of the exam answer, right? Material extracted from blah blah blah, right? Or just put in. I would use the in-text citation style, right? I mean, go with the format that UL recommends eventually, but keep all of this in mind. So my job here is to tell you, right, that when you're prepping for the exam, that means your revision, right? Your revision notes should include, right, where the sources, what the sources are, right? So that you don't waste your time and scramble later on. Because when you go back and look for the sources, right, very difficult, right? So you do it, from this period onwards. Okay, all right. That is important. That's what I wanted to emphasize, to you. Important to make sure that your notes are organized, right? Since it's going to be an online exam, which you all are all elated about. Okay. Not sure, I'm not. I hope that think about it. Online exam also means that the questions may be more application style. It's not so straightforward. This course already very complicated, right? The exam question. So think about that a little bit. So be prepared, right? For a little bit more application style questions. I mean, I think the exam paper would have already been set already, lah, right? I don't think they would change the exam paper now, right? But just be prepared for application style questions because they already mentioned it to us already. UL, when we had a meeting, they already mentioned it, about how when it's online exam, they don't test out of syllabus, but the expectation is that students will be able to write more application style answers. Okay, so think about that when you are prepping for your exam. Yeah, I agree with Yipeng's comment about the Zone B questions being a little bit tougher than Zone A. Yipeng, I do agree with you. I have noticed it also. Right. Zone A questions on this a little bit more straightforward. I don't know. I don't know exactly who belongs to Zone A, and why there is this discrepancy. I don't know. I don't know. I really don't know. I don't want to get involved in this also. This COVID pandemic time, jobs are very precious, okay. So I shall keep quiet about this. I honestly do not know. Honestly, I do not know about this, thing. But I did notice that the Zone A questions do tend to be a little bit more straightforward, shorter quotes, like straight to the point kind of question. Zone B, and sometimes Zone B also has got uh different kind of questions. Like Zone A, like, oh, I've seen this question appear before, like in a couple of years ago. Zone B, like, hey, what is this new thing? I do not know why, but never mind. It's okay. That means it also shows that if you're able to clear, right, then the tougher the exam you took and the better you clear it, then the better you are, lah, right? Yeah, just tell yourself that if you're gonna get hung up on this kind of things, if I'm gonna get hung up on the fact that when I was doing undergrad, I didn't have textbook, I didn't have 30 slides, I had 2 slides, and then the lecturer come talk, 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 and then you stone for 2 seconds, you die because you've just lost everything already, right? I cannot be hung up on that, and then do the same to you all, right? I cannot do mother-in-law, daughter-in-law thing, right? I mean, you know what I mean, right? Yeah. So don't get hung up on this. Okay. Just tell yourself that you're stronger. Okay. All right. You drink bubble tea and that you are stronger and you're able to write answers better. All right. Just tell yourself that. Right, Yipeng? Okay. Okay. I want to not finish late, and I do not want to leave any leftovers for next week. Right. So I'm just going to go through some of the material that you see down here. Is sort of a bit repetitive, right? Some of the main points we're emphasizing on. I'm not going to go through every single slide, like relating to, say, for example, the institutional structure also, right? Because it's there, and some of it doesn't really. I really doubt you will use it to much extent, right? So certain points I will just emphasize on. Okay, all right. So let's talk about Agenda 2063, right? So the link is there for you to the Agenda 2063 discussion, right? Okay, so basically what you want to highlight when you talk about the AU, let me just start off like with a small preface of the AU, right? So if the OAU, right, was basically known for helping with things like issues like apartheid or mediating border conflicts and peacekeeping missions and so on. The AU's focus was slightly different because remember our last line from the last slides from the other set of lecture notes, lecture 17, right, was about how they wanted a revamped version of the OAU, right? So when you look at, I think there's a good phrase to use when you talk about the AU versus the OAU, right? So it's revamped, right? The focus was a little bit more on things like peacekeeping, right, or stability. When you talk about peace, it automatically goes towards the idea of security. It goes towards the idea of stability, right? Education, okay, health, democracy, human rights, right? These were basically the focus, all right? Let me repeat. Peace related to that, stability and security. So peace, stability, security, right? Education, health, democracy, human rights. Education, health, democracy, human rights, right? These would be like fundamental issues identified, right? In order that need to be addressed, right? In order for the state to, in order for the states or the continent to move forward, all right? Okay, because these are the issues like anything related to education, things that are related to democracy, right? Related to things like human rights, right? Link it to the idea of critical development. Remember we've mentioned this before? The logic of critical development, right? So we talk about critical development, right? Is to do with self-sufficiency. It is to do with democratic accountability, right? It is to do with the lifting up of communities, societies, right, from the abject, poverty or from these vicious cycles that they tend to get trapped in, right? So this goes towards the idea of development, and from our understanding, right, it is to do with the idea of critical development, right? These contribute to critical development. As to how successful they actually have been, right, is another issue altogether, lah, right? But what you want to emphasize on or highlight, on is basically that this is now at least they've identified the issues, right, related to it. So remember, just like how I said also about the League of Nations, for example, right? We criticized the League of Nations and we said that look, it didn't achieve many of the items on its agenda, right? Like disarmament and so on, right? But the fact is that what we are appreciative is that it identified what are the critical issues that were facing international society at that point. And for that, we give it the credit necessary. So same thing down here. We want to explain, right, that they have identified, the major issues, right, that confound international society in Africa, right, and they are working towards it. So that softens, the blow, or softens the critique that you are leveling, against the AU as well, right? So they have identified it. If you've identified it, it's on the agenda. Number one, it helps you to assess effectiveness. Number two, right, it is also a rationale where you can inject in your conclusion, right, that at least they've identified the issues, right, and they have been placed on the agenda, which means that it can be, while they may not have achieved it at the current point, right, or there's been dismal achievements related to these different issue areas, right, at least these function as like a long-term project, right, or it's a work in progress. So at least you can have some kind of evaluation at the end of your exam answer, right, that sort of tells the market that look, you thought about these issues. It is not just a textbook regurgitation of okay, this is what they'll focus on, this is what they did, this is what they didn't do, finish, full stop, right? So at least that allows you to inject a little bit more analysis into the discussion. Okay, so the Agenda 2063 is a strategic framework for socio-economic transformation. So I like these kinds of phrases. When they say socio-economic, it tells you what the focus of the organization actually is. It's not socio-political, it's socio-economic. So these are little clues, right? For over the next 60 years, from 2013 to 2063. All right, and it is a reiteration of the Pan-African drive, right, for unity, self-determination, freedom, progress, collective prosperity and so on, right? And you want to emphasize on this point, this point about Pan-Africanism, this point about self-determination and so on. Why? Because you want to go back to the logic of the baggage from colonialism. It's not, we keep reiterating that the organizing principle is sovereignty. But why, right, are they so hung up on that concept of sovereignty? Okay, don't use the word hung up, it doesn't sound nice. Why do they pursue it so actively? Or why is it, such a major part of their consciousness, right, relating to individual states and the regional organization, right? So it's to do with the colonial baggage, the colonial baggage, right? Or the colonization baggage that they've experienced, right? Okay, it's a bottom-up approach, right? With extensive consultations of the African citizenry, right? So it is not the work of the bureaucrats, right? But rather it is an agenda that is driven by the voices of the African people, right? Which and anything, I always take this approach, right? It's a bit of a public admin style approach, right? And it's also, relating to the logic of democratic accountability, right? Any kind of system that attempts to bring government or the delivery of public goods and services or the decision-making process closer to the citizens, right, should have some merit. Why? Because the voices of the citizens is what the government requires to hear, because then only will you get policies, right, that are nuanced, that tailor, that respond to the needs and the wants of the citizens, right, as opposed to a top-down implementation, right? So that is another point of credit towards the AU in this sense, right? If it's driven by bureaucrats, right, and you must and why I want to emphasize this, if you think about the logic of bureaucrats, if you think about the logic of elites, right, in this particular context, think carefully about what this basically translates into. There's a high level of discrepancy or a high level of inequalities that exist, right, within this political and policy context that we're looking at, right? So you've got income inequality, you've got discrepancies, right, that relate to gender, right? So you've got gender inequality, right? You've got some states, right, within the African continent that have experienced relatively good levels of economic growth. Some states have got hard power. Some states have got soft power, right? And across the entire continent, right, you do not have this even, capacities. You do not have even levels of development. We established this when we talked about the background, right? Okay. And so when you look at it, in terms of this, right, if you are including the voices of the citizens, right, then that can help to mitigate some of the effects of policies that are being made if they are only being made, from a top-down approach, right? Policies only made from a top-down approach. Basically, it reflects the mentality of perhaps the more well-to-do, the richer, well-to-do, richer, the same thing, sorry. The more well-to-do, the better educated, the tribes or the ethnic groups that may be in control of government, right? Because you have got majority and minority ethnic groups, like the Hutus versus the Tutsis, for example. When you looked at the Rwandan genocide, right, which creates the minority majority mentality, correct? Right. So if it's a bottom up approach, right, then it may help to mitigate some of these effects, right, that may originate if you had an opposite approach, which is then a top down approach, a bottom up effect, right? A bottom up approach, right, to policy making. Democratic accountability is of course more value, right, in comparison to the top down approach. You understand? All right, and why we emphasize this is because this is compounded by the background that we discussed earlier on. You understand how to connect the idea? You understand? You understand where I'm going with this argument? Okay? Okay? All right. Okay. Anybody needs me to explain again? Okay, yeah, I thought I saw you shake your head. The logic is that, okay, the logic is that, okay, when you look at the background of Africa, okay, and you look at the various inequalities that exist within the entire system. So it can be gender inequality, it can be economic inequalities, discrepancies or inequalities that arise from majority, minority, ethnic groups or tribal groups and cleavages and so on. Which are the tribal groups or which are the ethnic groups that are in control of government that create this minority majority mentality, right? Okay, so that is the background that we referred to. The background also refers to the idea of some states being economically superior to other states. You may have a scenario. You have some states that are that have better hard power projection than other states, right? So stronger militaries, bigger budgets, and so on. Some states within the continent have experienced economic growth, like higher levels of GDP. You've got this discrepancy, right? You've got some states like Mali and Sudan, right, who have experienced decades of protracted civil conflict. They are at the bottom of the any kind of human development index, right? That the UN develops and so on. They are the least developing countries and so on, right? So if you have this kind of political and policy context, right, and you have decisions that are made from a top-down approach, meaning the elites, meaning governments, meaning bureaucrats make these kinds of decisions. Do they accurately, right? Are these decisions able to accurately address the needs and the wants of the citizens, which are so varied in this case? But if it is a bottom-up approach, like what the Agenda 2063 basically is about, right, then that would more accurately reflect the needs, wants, preferences of the citizens according to the various contexts that they, live in. All right. Okay. So the rationale is that when we look at a top-down approach of decision making, right, a top-down approach of policy making, right, what kind of policies do you get? You get policies that reflect, right, say for example, what the elites basically want, or you get policies that reflect what the bureaucrats are trained to do, or the bureaucrats are directed to do by the government or by the elected politicians and so on, right? But when you have a bottom-up approach, that is basically the idea of bringing policy making or bringing decision making closer to the citizens, right? And that increases or enhances democratic accountability, right? And that ties in also with what AU basically wanted to address, right? Remember just now I mentioned it was looking at things like human rights, democracy, education, and so on. So that is where we link this idea. That is why I emphasize on the concept of the bottom-up approach. Every time something is top-down, right? Does it reach the citizens? Is it what the citizens want? Like if you have a huge state, right, and the decisions are being made, at like federalism, right? Because decisions that are made in the capital, right, and that results in a capital only mindset. You're reflecting what the needs and the wants of the elites are, or the richer are, or the more educated are, or the majority are, and so on. Okay, are we okay on this one? Okay, all right, everybody okay? Okay. All right. So this is a way of analyzing the issue. So rather than just say, oh yeah, it's bottom up. So what? Right. That's always my question, right? Okay, so you want to inject the analysis in, right? Okay. All right. Then of course they have the monitoring and so these are different aspects, right? So the first one is the bottom up approach. Second one is the monitoring and evaluation function or accountability, right? So remember, with the OAU being less than successful, right? They added in this monitoring evaluation component to the Agenda 2063, policy and coherent space, right? Okay, so this one is a marked difference from the OAU, right? Where for the first time, right, all of the continental and regional initiatives brought under one umbrella. Remember earlier on, we talked about the redundancy and the overlap, right? So here, right, it brings all of these different initiatives under one umbrella, right? And what does this contribute to? So integration, is expected to enhance consistency, remove policy overlaps, remove redundancy, right? And in doing so, it will also create space for the management of diversity and whatever unique factors or whatever unique, concepts, right, related to, all the members in the in the AU, Now we're talking about AU, all right? Okay, so this integration, right, expects to enhance consistency, remove your policy overlap, remove the redundancies, right, and create more space for managing all of the various, diverse, uh, you know, um, characteristics, right, of all the states and so on, right? Okay, all right. Then you've got financing and partnership, right? So they've, identified key areas of intervention and associated funding options, right? Why do I put down there related to ownership, right? Because remember, it goes back to the idea when states, right, or individuals or, groups of people, right, when they feel that they have ownership, right, then they will be more committed to the principles of a policy program, or they're more committed to, the organization and so on. That feeling of ownership, right? Because now it becomes, your responsibility. Now it directly impacts on your well-being and so on, right? And it also signals higher levels of involvement, right? So again, the logic of it being bottom up, the logic of, including more voices and so on, right? That becomes, significant. Okay, all right. Okay, so you look at the origins, right? Okay, it came out of the 2000 summit, right? Basically, you have all the, different states, head of states, right, under the chairmanship of Mbeki, right? And we go back to square one all over again, like how they were quibbling over the establishment of the OAU. Remember, you had the discrepancies the discrepancies in ideas between the Casablanca, Brazzaville, and Monrovia groups within. Remember the Francophone and the Anglophone groups that were within the OAU, right? And they all had different ideas as to how they wanted to establish the organization and how they wanted it to look like, right? So same thing down here, right? So the rationale is that constantly, right, that from the get-go, there is fragmentation, right, within the organization. They already have different ideas, right? And that is already, the cracks, that are starting to appear, right? So Mibiki, basically wanted, to hijack and use and I would use the word hijack. It's a bit of a harsh word in this case, but it basically that's what it boils down to, right? He wanted to use the AU, right, to transplant, legitimate his own homegrown brand of neoliberalism, right? And he wanted, an international organization or regional organization that would basically promote economic liberalization and political democratization, right? And basically, erase the erase the hitherto. I like that phrase, HITHERTO, right? Erase that, hitherto image, of negative image that, the international community has of, South Africa, right? Because of many decades of appetite, right? Appetite. But Nigeria also wants to utilize the AU to fulfill its own ambitions as well, right? So Obasanjo wanted the AU, right, to look more like the OSCE, right? Case in point down here, right? There is a lot of they are using these regional organizations in Europe as a reference point, right, when they want to craft the organization. But, right, this is also a stumbling block. While they may be inspired, right, by the successes of the European organizations like, EU and the OSCE, for instance, right? Okay, does that then hamper, or does that make them uh, think about crafting an organization for themselves, right? Which is really far too ambitious, lofty, right? In that sense, correct? Because the rationale is that the political and policy context that exists in Europe, the level of development, right, that exists in Europe, the ideals, the values, the organizing principles cannot be replicated anywhere else, right? But you are attempting to look at, this organization that has functioned well, and you say, I want to create another organization in this context, right? That is similar. So basically, the logic is that are you setting yourself up for failure? right, because of the lofty ambitions associated with it. So that could be one argument point, right? So that means the creation of the organization, right? Number one, it's fraught with challenges in terms of the fragmentation, right? The disagreements among the different leaders who are leading the creation of the organization, who each have their own agenda to fulfill. Some agendas are more personal than other agendas. Like Mbeki's agenda, I would say, is more personal, right, than Obasanjo's agenda, right? But so that is one argument. Then another argument, right, highlights this logic about taking a leaf from these international organizations that have been successful, but for different reasons, right? So you can't expect to transplant, right? The ideas from one region to from another region. You can't expect to transplant the ideas of one organization expected to take root, especially given the constraints, right, that the entire region basically faces, right? Okay, so that is the basis of the argument down there, right? So Obasanjo's plan was basically seen to be more radical, right? Mbeki basically wants it to be committed to socio-economic development, right? But it wants the Obasanjo was looking at it in a very lofty, ambitious way. You want to have it developed, as a foremost IO. You want to deal with so many different issues relating to security, stability, and developmental challenges. Just dealing with security alone, right, has placed NATO in an extremely precarious position. And this only deals with the idea of collective security and the security community. In a region fraught with so many more challenges that are social, that are developmental, that are economic and political in nature, right? And Obasanjo is thinking about wanting to create an organization that will deal with all of these different issues at the same time, right? And it also wants to incorporate the idea of NGOs, right, to complement the reform program, right? So again, the ambitions are very lofty, right? Okay. So what basically you want to explain down here, right, is that the difference between Mbeki's vision and Obasanjo's vision, right? Okay, Obasanjo basically was thinking about the potential for political reform and basically wants to push for Nigerian leadership using the AU, right? And basically what you see is that both of them are competing. So the different states competing for primacy, right? And why they compete for primacy? Because they want to helm the IO, Helm, helm. They want to be at the helm of it, right? And they want to basically further, right, their own domestic agendas, right? Because one wants to cement his own brand of neoliberalism, right? And wants to bring back the restore glory to South Africa, or restore name to South Africa, right? The other one wants to bring Nigerian leadership and cement it, right? So basically they want to further their own domestic agendas. So what kind of lenses are they basically wearing? Goes back to the same idea of wearing realist lenses, right? Okay, because it is state centric, right? Because each of these states are thinking about their own state goals, right? So state centric, right? And there is like there's minimal policy seeking vision because they are still thinking about socioeconomic development and reform and political reform and involvement of NGOs and so on, right? So the rationale is that there is some policy seeking vision, right? Meaning that they are interested in formulating policy relating to integration and development and so on. But at the end of the day, right, it's still a reflection of the state's interest, right? So it goes back to the idea of an organization such as this, which is supposed to be created to promote integration, right? If all your states are wearing their realist lenses, especially states that are mooting, the creation of the organization, then how effective is the organization eventually going to be, right? So that's the main argument down here. Okay, so Gaddafi then comes up with his own idea to promote his own domestic interests as well. All right, so basically he sketched his own design and he wanted it to be similar to the United States of Africa, right? So there was a three-way argument all over again, very similar to like what we saw with the creation of the OAU, the Monrovia, Brazzaville, and Casablanca groups, right? So eventually it was when they crafted the founding document of what's that, founding document of the AU, right? It was more in line, obviously, with the Mibeki's and Obasanjo's vision, right? But still, there is no. I would say that it's already fragmented, right? There's all there's again, it results in this compromise kind of a document, right? Because you're trying to incorporate both these ideas together, right? So that's basically what you want to emphasize, right, when you talk about the creation of the organization. So again, how would this then impact on the effectiveness, right? So emphasis placed on the legal obligations, right? Many of which they were in response to the logic of states starting to think more carefully, right, about self-determination, more carefully about the idea of establishing democratic institutions within the states. And it's about time, right? Because you're looking at it in 2000, majority of states, right, in African continent basically became independent, right, in about the last batches were about 1960s, right? So 40 years already, it's about time you start thinking about, shaping up democratic institutions within the state, right? And they're looking towards, the organization to help them, consolidate democratic institutions, right? In a region where authoritarian regimes that are replete with third termism, regimes that reflect a lack of transfer of power, right? You have extremely old politicians, right, 90 plus years old, who run for elections and then they don't want to step down. They also somehow very long life, right, and they just remain in power. So that's the logic. A very layman description of third termism. There's no alternation of power, right? In very authoritarian nature, in nature, very few political, electorally significant political parties, and refusal to step down and so on, right? Okay, so that's basically the idea down here. So this can be thought of as like a key normative contribution of the AU, right? Basically because you're looking at it sort of attempts to complement the Agenda 2063. Because remember, Agenda 2063 was looking at some of the aspirations, right? Like having good governance, looking at democratic values, looking at attempting to increase gender equality, right? Respect for human rights, justice, and rule of law. So these are the areas that they identified, right? And now, when you look at, the how they were crafting the founding documents of the AU, right? There's an incorporation of these ideas, right? So you would say that this signals sort of like an improvement over the OAU, right, in comparison to what that stood for, and how they allowed all of these different distinctions between the founding leaders, right, to basically create negative implications on the organization. AU was actually markedly different, right? Then you look at the founding document and the establishment, right, of the AU, right, via the Sirte Declaration, right? So basically, that declaration announces the establishment of the AU, right? Basically, they wanted to create the Constitutive Act, right, of the AU, and they also wanted to start convening the different conferences, right? So the first one was an African Ministerial Conference on Security, Stability, Development, and Cooperation. Look at the agenda of these different conferences, right? What is the focus of these various conferences? That tells you, right, that these are the issue areas and the problems that have been identified, right, by the organization and by the different heads of states, right? So the first, the foremost, emphasis is placed on things like security, stability. Goes back to the background, the political and policy context of Africa, right? How you've got the vicious cycle of being trapped in the civil conflict and the access to resources, or the resource curse, right? You're familiar with the idea of resource curse. Did we talk about this the previous week? Yes, right. We talked about it, right? So things like the resource curse, right, or what they refer to as the oil curse, right, or the status of being peripheral states and so on, right? So how it goes back, to these ideas of, what is it? What are the urgent ideas, on the agenda that need to be solved, right? Okay. All right. Okay. Okay. Then you look at the various organs, right, within the AU. Okay. So you've got the assembly, right, which is the heads of state, the government, right, or whichever the duty accredited representatives and so on. So that's basically, the main, heart of the organization, right? You've got the assembly is the one that determines the policies, right? They approve the budget, they establish the AU organs, right? They issue directives, and so on. Okay. And what is important here, right, is that decisions are supposed to be reached by consensus, right? So remember, consensus decision making, right, has got a plus and it's got a minus, right? Consensus decision making, number one, allows for better, more nuanced decision making because you are basically taking into consideration what the inputs of the various members are. Number two, right, in a crisis scenario, right, you can basically end up with a deadlock or a gridlock, policy gridlock, right? Because you have several veto players. All of the different members all function as veto players, right? So consensus decision making can be problematic, right? Especially in this political and policy context. I don't know how many times I said this phrase already, right? But you should understand by now, right, how important, why I'm emphasizing on that so much, right? In a particular, policy and political context like that of, the African continent, where you've got many different types of crisis, right? Of many different types of crisis abound, right? So you've got economic crisis, you've got civil conflict, you've got access to resources and so on, right? So in these kinds of scenarios, right, obviously consensus decision making can be a little bit problematic, but they have a 2/3 majority that can break a deadlock. But think about this also, okay? Think about how the OAU was formed, right? And how support for the formation of the OAU was split, right, among the three different groups. Same thing down here. You've got three different groups. You had Gaddafi, you had Mbeki, and you had Obasanjo, right? Obviously, they have got their own allies or their own cliques, right? Their own little groups within, right, the region as well, right? So when you talk about having a 2/3 majority, you also need to think about it, right, in terms of fragmentation, the initial fragmentation, right, in response to creating the organization. Everybody has got different ideas, right? Now you say you require a 2/3 majority that can break a deadlock, right? Are there within the organization, right? May you have little voting blocks, right? Because different states are aligned to different groupings, right? You could have different groupings, right? So the fragmentation point is important to emphasize when you talk about these kinds of organizations. Okay, contrary to the OAU, right? In where you had none of the official documents were legally binding, right? You have the AU, right, assembly, which is able to issue declarations, right, and decisions. Okay, so when you look at declarations and decisions, the decisions are binding. Right? Can you please indicate that? Right? Decisions are binding, right? Declaration is not binding. They have informal authority, right? Okay. They basically, when you have informal authority, right, for the declarations, right, it is basically there to encourage states, right, to voluntarily cooperate, and to create more harmonization. So they don't want to force states, right, to do so, or is it because they're still thinking about the principle of sovereignty and non-interference, right? But at least now you have the decisions that are legally binding, at least one of it. And the second type, which is the declarations, it's like the idea of non-entrepreneurship, right? It is reiterating to states, okay, these are rules of membership and rules of behavior that we expect or we encourage you to abide by, right? And it is up to you to internalize, comprehend, right, and behave accordingly, right? So the whole idea of how actors' expectations converge, relating to the rules of membership, rules of behavior, and so on, right? So you could also say that from a constructivist perspective, right, this could also relate to the idea of social influence, right? The influence and persuasion. Remember the argument, right? So you could link it to that as well, right? Okay. So no matter how you look at it, whether you have this declarations that have informal authority, right? Versus the decisions. The logic here is that the endpoint that you want to emphasize, it's still an improvement over the OAU. Definitely, it's an improvement over the OAU. Okay. All right. Wait now, why is it not moving? Okay, all right. Then you've got the executive council, right? Okay, basically the executive council, responsible for implementation, monitoring of AU policies on issues like trade, resources, education, and so on, right? It doesn't really have much authority, or it doesn't really have any mandate on regional or internal security and so on, right? So that's basically what the executive council is about, right? Okay. It's just look at the different policy areas, right? Then you look at the commission. Okay, the commission is actually quite a key organ, right? Similar to the assembly, right? So assembly and commission are the two more key or more significant organs within the AU, right? It's basically plays a central role in the day-to-day running of the organization, or day-to-day management of the organization, right? So that's basically why the commission and the assembly, right, are both quite significant, right? I would say, for example, like how I emphasize on what the main role of the assembly is, right? And I talked about the declarations and the decisions. Same thing with the commission, right? Maybe you can, just mention like how I did, summarize it by saying that it is a key organ within the AU because it plays a critical role in the day-to-day management of the AU, and then pick out a couple, one or two of these, right? Say for example, it is the main organization, main organ that represents the union and defends its interests. And then maybe you could say that it drafts the common position of the AU, right? Because these two things, right? If it defends interest, that means it is representative. Number two, if you're talking about drafting common positions of the AU, then basically it is like the voice behind the organization, right? So pick out you cannot obviously be replicating all of this in your exam, right? So pick out one or two points that are key, right? That provide an overview of the organ that you are emphasizing. Why is it important? Why is it critical to the day-to-day functioning of the organ? What kind of powers does it have, right? How representative it is, right? What kind of legitimacy or institutionalization does it experience, right? Please do not spend your time writing chunks and chunks of information that do not relate to the question, right? That's very important. Now that we come back to this conclusion that your exam is going to be online, remember, online exam, if they give you a longer period of time, what do you have? You have a word limit, right? So you cannot afford to waste your word limit, right, on unnecessary or less than, okay, I wouldn't say, okay, wrong word to use. It's not unnecessary details. It's less than important details that relate to the question. Correct. So you do not want to waste your word limit on that. So you got to like now streamline and summarize the different ideas that you want to emphasize on. Okay. These are the different commission portfolios. Same thing also, right? You may want to pick out one or two. If it were me, I would pick out the first two in particular, right? The peace and security and the political affairs, right? Because number one, if you had talked about Agenda 2063, or if you had talked about how the the AU is a departure from the OAU in terms of talking about human rights and democracy, education and peace and security, stability, all of these things, then it would tie in nicely. So what you want to do is ensure throughout your exam answer, right, not just for this topic but any other topic also, right, throughout the exam answer you want to have that flow, right, that reiterates certain points again and again, right? So you want to make an emphasis on this. Then after that, the first two, the peace and security and the political affairs, I would say are extremely critical, right, to the organization. Not to say the others are not critical, right, but these two in particular are extremely critical. Then you can mention one or two. Say for example, you could mention things like Social affairs would be another one, a good one to mention, because it talks about healthcare. It talks about drug control in particular, right? It talks about migration, right? Which are key because of the political and policy context, because these are the issues that have been confounding African states, right? Say, for example, healthcare, maternal health, infant mortality, right? If we talk about migration, migration is a result of number one, native lands no longer being arable, no longer being livable, right? They cannot make their livelihoods there anymore, so they move, right? Or migration, moving from the more rural areas, right, to the city centers, right, in search for employment or education opportunities and so on. So find a way, if you're going to be mentioning any of these portfolios, right, find a way to make an emphasis or a linkage, right, towards maybe a problem, right, that you have discussed so far relating to the background, right, or relating to an issue that is of critical importance, right? So even things like, say, for example, um, if you discuss things like, say, for example, let me pick up one. If we discuss, say, the rural economy and agriculture, right? Because you talk about agriculture and food security, water and natural, resources and desertification, right? That links to what? Things like food security, climate change, environmental degradation. So again, what you are presenting is a very tight argument, right? So it shows the marker that you have thought about, which are the problems associated with the state, right? And then what are the, what kind of efforts the organization is making to address these problems that have been identified. So that would be a tighter argument. Okay. All right. All right. Okay. Then you've got, other different, councils or, sub organs or bodies within it, right? So just you can mention, one or two. Again, say I would talk about the Peace and Security Council, right? So you say that, there was a creation of the Peace and Security Council, because subsequently you can mention some of the activities of the Peace and Security Council, right? I would also make mention, say, for example, of ECOSOC, right? Because the ECOSOC is basically an advisory organ, right, that helps to address the different bring together the different groups of the member states of AU. So there's an umbrella organization that helps to streamline, right? Then also I would mention maybe Court of Justice, right? So how the Court of Justice is relevant, because again we talked about the dispute resolution mechanism, we talked about the interpretation of law, right? And you talk about the idea of human rights violation, right? Which is something that you want to emphasize on, given the high instances of authoritarian regimes. Number one, number two, right? If you talk about authoritarian regimes, weak institutions, right, poor governance, then you also have an instance where you've got state-sponsored violence against their own citizens, like what you see in the case of Sudan, right? And then you also have the logic of civil conflict, right? So given these factors, right, then the Court of Justice becomes something that is a relevant organ that you want to make mention of or emphasize on when you write your answer. Okay? All right. I mean, up to you. It's up to you which one you want to pick. I'm just giving you ideas, right? Or just giving you suggestions as as to whichever you want to emphasize on, right? Okay, then you've got all the different. I'm not going to run through this, right? You've got different technical committees and the financial institutions, right? I'm not going to run through this, right? Because it's not much for me to say about that. All right. Then you've got Nepat, right, which is a new partnership for Africa's development. This is your technical body of the AU, right? Basically, when you look at Nepat, right, it's like contributing to capacity building, right? That's basically the idea. When you have a technical body, right, that's basically what technical bodies are about, right? They are related to capacity building, right? So they address different trends, different issues related to Africa, right? And it's to do with investment in particular. So look at the different issue areas. I know, I'm sorry, it's very bright on the screen, right? Okay, but you look at the different issue areas, right? Human capital development, skills, youth employment, women empowerment, you've got industrialization, science, tech, you've got regional integration, right? And you've got infrastructural development, and then you've got governance and food security. The first, in fact, you look at all three of it, all four of it, right? You will realize, okay, that these are number one, right, related to the idea of critical development, right? Because look at the different issue areas, right? The first three in particular, right? Human capital in terms of skills, development, youth employment, and so on. What does this relate to? This relates to self-sufficiency. It relates to the uplifting, upward mobility of communities, right? Okay. If you look at, industrialization, your science and tech, your infrastructural developments, and so on, right? That basically goes towards the ideas of, sustainable development. You're looking at how to harness technology. You're looking at how to create infrastructure for long-term, developmental projects and so on, right? So again, that goes towards the idea of critical development. These are aspects of critical development, right? Then the last one, when you look at, governance and food security also, it is about the self-sufficiency, it's about security of people, right? So you notice that, these all, go towards the idea of critical development. It's not mentioned anywhere, right? But you can say that, it contributes or it fulfills the idea of, development, in especially in the more critical sense, or at least attempts to do so, right? So this is how you could use, the arguments down here, right? What are the focus of the different programs, right? What are the issues that they want to target, and how, if harnessed well, if managed well, if well funded, right, these can actually go towards mitigating a lot of the problems that have been identified that citizens are facing, right, in the African continent, especially in the long run. These are all, I think, there's also maybe this angle that you want to add in, to your exam answer, right? That sometimes it may be unfair, right, to expect a lot from these kinds of organizations, right? Because, like what I established earlier on, they are compounded, right, by endogenous and exogenous troubles, correct? These challenges that they face, right? It's fraught with all of these challenges. Then, it may be too premature, right, to, criticize them and say they've not achieved enough, right? So what you may want to emphasize is that it may be too premature to expect to see, positive effects out of all of these programs, right? Because, they were established around 2000. When was this one established with? This one was 2002, right? 2002. Today, now it's 2022. 20 years later, right? Some people will say, oh, 20 years, you had 2 decades, right, to get your act together and to, address all of these different issues. Yes, but in those 20 years, what else did they have to deal with? A plethora of protracted civil conflict, right? And then, economic crisis, right? Interference by great powers like, say, for example, China, right, which has been often painted as a new colonizer, sorry, especially with its, involvement in Africa, right? Like, the entire AU headquarters, right, the building itself was actually a gift from China, right? Right? We've mentioned it before, right? Yeah. So the rationale down here, and how some of these great powers and great states, right, leverage on things like, financial assistance or loans to these states to extract, particular concessions and so on, or have access to markets, and cheap labor and so on, right? So we need to take all of these other things into consideration. So that's why I always say, don't be so harsh, or don't have a knee-jerk reaction to say that, yeah, 20 years, and you're still, haven't gotten your act together. Now, right, compounded in the last 2 years, right, all of these issues compounded by, unfortunately, the COVID-19 pandemic and the effects, the resultant fallout and the effects of it, right? So, think about these things, and, maybe then you can use the idea of how long-term, right, these are long-term projects, right, that may see fruition subsequently, right? And then, and you can add on your qualifier to say that, at the end of the day, it depends on whether how well it's managed. It depends on whether they have to fight fire. Basically the idea of firefighting, right? Every day there's another problem that crops up, and they have to deal with it, right? Okay, so where you want to emphasize on is that it is a marked difference, right, from OAU, especially the institutional pathology that it experienced, right? More future oriented stance, because you notice a lot of the portfolios, right, what are they related to? Investments in science and tech, innovation and so on, right? Okay, so that's the rationale. It's more future oriented, right? So it seeks to advance development of Africa, right, by promoting research and development, right, in several different fields like science and tech and so on, right? And what does that do? That helps to bring the continent up to speed, right, with other developed states as well, right? So it's no longer a case, they want to move away from that stereotypical image that the entire world has painted of Africa, right? Your bloated child, a bloated tummy, child with bloated tummy and flies, logic, and the desert and so on, right? That's a stereotypical image that's basically been created, and they're moving away from that, right? Okay, so basically what they want to also do is that if they have developments in science and tech, then they can collaborate and cooperate with other international partners relating to anything in the field of medicine and science and tech. Okay, and then they will be able to address preventable diseases and social ills, which is a large stumbling block, right? Okay, and of course, unlike the OAU, right, they wanted to move away from the statist philosophy. Of course, that's the intention. They wanted to move away from it, right? But the creation of the OAU already was plagued by the statist philosophy, right? Okay, so the mandate, of course, in OAU's constitutive act is actually far more different and more comprehensive than of the OAU. Remember, the OAU's founding charter, right? What was the main emphasis? There are several different clauses, right? I think three main clauses that I highlighted that basically were all related to non-intervention, non-interference, and protection of sovereignty. That was the main focus, right? That basically was in the OAU's founding document that tied its hands, right? And the AU basically wanted, to depart from that. Okay, so let's look at the normative innovation relating to the founding document, right? Okay, so basically it is it still, it doesn't, not to say that there's no emphasis on sovereignty anymore. There is an emphasis on sovereignty, right? But the rationale is that they are now thinking about looking at the Article 4H. Maybe I underline that one, because that is the major argument that you're going to make when you talk about how it's a departure from OAU, right? Article 4H, right? Establish the right of the Union to intervene in a member state pursuant to decision of the Assembly, right, in respect of grave circumstances, namely war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, right? Very important. Why? Number one, okay, it talks about the logic of non-interference and non-intervention and sovereignty being suspended, right, in the face of irresponsible behavior of the state, right? If the state engages in things like war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity. Okay, all right. So that's the main focus there. Number two, right? We talk about the idea that that means the logic is that sovereignty is not a foregone conclusion. It is not something that states can automatically say, you cannot intervene in my state because this is domestic affair. This is between these two different tribes and the tribe that's controlling government and so on, right? So it is no longer a case where sovereignty is guaranteed, right? Okay, I'll come back to that in 1 second, right? Number three, right? Just before I forget, what does this also highlight, right? It highlights the importance of the assembly, the institutionalization, the empowerment of the assembly. All right, okay. Let me go back to the second point just now when I talked about the sovereignty and non-interference in the domestic affairs, right? What does that emphasize on? That emphasizes, or that brings us to that question, right? At what point, right, does a state forfeit its right to sovereignty, right, that allows the external actors to intervene in its domestic affairs, right? So the rationale is that when you look at the ideas of war crime, genocide, crimes against humanity, right? What do we link that to? We link that to the idea that go back to the logic of where sovereignty comes from. 1933 Montevideo Convention, right? The principles that state that a state is sovereign when it is able to conduct diplomatic relations, when it protects its population and its territory, most importantly, right? Crimes against humanity, right? Even if for whatever reason, right? Genocide for whatever reason, right, is basically contravenes that principle, right? So that goes to the question: at what point does a state forfeit its right, to sovereignty, right, to allow humanitarian intervention or to allow intervention to occur in the first place, right? So that's basically what the that focus of Article 4H is basically about, right? AU is an IO, right? Was reluctant to make use of this right? So they included another article, right? That member states also have the right to request intervention from the union in order to restore peace and security, because the first one is basically uh, places a lot of power in the hands of the organization. So it goes back to the idea still that they know what is necessary in order to tackle these kinds of problems of crimes against humanity. But at the same time, right, they also want to prevent the organization from looking like it's overbearing. It is interested in interfering in domestic affairs of the state. So they add on another clause, right, to it to say that okay, states can request for intervention, right? States can request for us to restore peace and security and so on. But right, what is important is that in comparison, right, in comparison to other IOs, right, this was identified to be something that is extremely far-reaching. There's no other IO, even the UN, right, doesn't have a clause within its within its charter, right, to say that what's that? Where's the union can intervene, right? Given the circumstances of genocide, crimes against humanity, and so on. If the UN, imagine if the UN had such a clause in its charter, Rwandan genocide could have been prevented or more easily prevented. They wouldn't have been dithering, right, as to whether can we call it a genocide. They wouldn't have been, arguing as to whether we should or should not intervene, even with Commander Dele, giving a live, up-to-date, report, on the Rwandan genocide and so on, right? So the AU basically looks like, one of the first few organizations in the entire world really to give itself such a mandate, right? And you could say that this could have been a learning point, right, from the Rwandan genocide and other instances of large scale violence that the OAU stood on the bylines and watched, right? They basically rethought the entire idea, right, of sovereignty as a responsibility. So remember just now I mentioned the idea of at what point does a state forfeit its right to a sovereignty, right? And I talked about the Montevideo Convention, right? And then you link it back to what is written down here. Sovereignty is a responsibility, right? So sovereignty is not a God-given right. Sovereignty is not foregone conclusion. You need to earn, right, that sovereignty. It is a privilege, right, rather than a right in that sense, right? Right? You understand the logic down here, right? So that means a state can lose, right, its claim to sovereignty, right, if it is irresponsible, right, towards its citizens. So that is how I frame the entire argument just now, right? So you can condense whatever that is on this slide, right, and reframe it, right, according to that argument about what does sovereignty mean, while it is so precious to the states, right? How should it actually be better managed? It's about management, isn't it? It's about management, right? It's about, it's not about saying that, oh, all states are sovereign, right, and therefore they can do whatever they want to do. But it's about now, a regional organization having a bit of say, right, related to that. Okay, all right. Right. Then you also have the imposition of sanctions on non-compliant states, right? Okay, Article 23, right? And then after that, 23(2) stipulates that a state's failure to comply with AU decisions and policies may result in tougher sanctions, right? So that was where the AU was leveling sanctions against Morocco with regards to the annexation of Western Sahara, right? Then remember just now I mentioned that, when you talk about the different sub-organs within the AU, right, you want to make mention of the PSC, right, the Peace and Security Council. So this is why I said make mention of the PSC if you're picking out any one of these sub-organs, right? Why? Because you have the PSC, right, that has the authority to take actions and take initiatives and actions it deems appropriate, right, in response to potential or existing conflicts. But the problem, with all of this is that look at the phrasing of, the mandate that is given to these sub-organs and so on. Take initiatives and action it deems appropriate. What is appropriate? When is it appropriate? How do we come to this conclusion that is appropriate or not? So there are, always escape clauses or loopholes that are inbuilt within a lot of these, declarations. So maybe lofty, it may be ambitious, it may be very far-reaching or comprehensive, but at what functions as a stumbling block, all right, is that number one, looks good on paper. Number two, it identifies, right, what the issues are. But number three, right, there are some of these loopholes and these gaps, right, that contribute, to less than efficient interpretation and application of these when the need arises. Okay, all right, okay. Your non-aggression and common defense pact, right, committed itself to prohibiting and preventing genocide, mass murder, as well as crimes against humanity. Another question, that I want to pose down here. Maybe some of you may find use for this argument, right? Notice, this organization, basically has placed a lot of emphasis on addressing issues related to, murder, crimes against humanity, genocide, and so on, right? But what is the root cause of all of this? You are finding ways to say that we will punish you. But basically, we interpret it, right? It basically says we will punish you if you engage in, crimes against humanity, if there's state-sponsored violence, if you're irresponsible towards your citizens, you engage in genocide, rape, and all of these things. Yeah, fine. Okay, fine, right? But why is it that there is no attempt or little attempt to address the root causes of all of these? Right? It's a reactive approach, right, to these major problems that exist in African international society, right? What about a proactive approach to STEM? Right? Why is it that genocide is used as a recourse to solving problems between competing, conflicting cleavages? Why is state-sponsored violence, allowed to occur and then say I will punish you subsequently? Or like, don't do it because there are punishments are available if you, if you engage in it. Right. So what are the root causes? What are the fundamental fragmentations that exist in African international society that prompt state leaders, right, to behave in the way that they do? Why do you see what happens in in Sudan, right, under like what Bashir did, right? Or why do you see protracted conflict and violence, right, in many of these states where women and children who are the most vulnerable are the most deeply affected by it, right? So think about that. There's something that I sit thinking about it, right? But think about that as well, right? So before you hail it, and say that oh, it's extremely it's extremely useful in targeting all of these problems, right? Think about what the question is asking you for, right? The question is focusing on problems that are within the region, right? Then you want to highlight how come that these regional organizations haven't been able to identify and target what the root cause actually is. Okay. All right. Then you've got the PSC, right? So a description of what the PSC is about, right? Where it, like I always say, highlight, where it's been active, right? So the ones that are the more common ones that you want to mention, like where you tend to see a lot of conflict breaking out, right? Would be Burundi, would be the one that you want to emphasize on. Ivory Coast, right? Okay. Darfur, Somalia, right? These are the the ones that always pop up, right? Okay. Like say like that's why I gave you the example for Burundi down there, right? In 2003, right? I find that the silencing the guns by 2020 is another example that you should mention, right? Okay, because it is one of the more recent programs under the PSC. Silencing the guns by 2020, right? The timeline that they gave themselves, right? Attempting to end war, civil conflict, gender-based violence, and so on in the continent by 2020, right? So that's not the question that I asked you. Why is it that they didn't make it, why did they have so much provisions, right? So this is one realization, right? How do we address the root cause of it? Because they want to attempt to prevent, right, genocide. They want to address the structural root causes of violent conflict in Africa. right? But this is a new initiative, number one. Number two, right? That means it took them a very long time to come to this, initiative, right? Number two, right? What the other issue is that, it has been hijacked, unfortunately, by the COVID-19 pandemic, right? So efforts have been redirected into a lot of these relief efforts, right, and so on, right? Okay, so that is what you want to mention, when you talk about the root causes of structural violence in Africa, right? And there is I mean, they have made a lot of efforts, right? They made a lot of inroads, definitely far more than what the OAU has done, right? But is that enough reason to celebrate, right? So, tentative or current assessment of the PSC highlights that there still is much to be it still much remains to be desired, right? When it comes to how they are leading peacekeeping and so on, right? In the continent itself, right? Okay, so then you've got other innovations like the African Union Convention on Preventing and Combating Convention, right? And those that related to governance, right? In Nepat as well, right? So both of this goes towards creating organizations that address good governance and accountability. So when you talk about governance, right? Good governance, accountability, transparency, democratic decision making ability all come under the same category, right? Okay, all right. And also you've got the idea, this it's repetitive in the sense that what are the issues that they've been identifying. So it's not like as if they do not know what the problems actually are. They know what the problems actually are, right? It's just a matter of, now cementing commitment on the part of the states, right, to address the issues, right? See, like, Article 4 of the Constitutive Act, right? They talk about gender equality, respect for democratic principles, rule of law, governance, and so on, right? It's just a matter of them subsequently then, adopting a lot of this, institutionalizing, right? A lot of this remains on paper, right? That's the point that you want to emphasize, right? Okay. All right. Some of it have been copied out from the OAU charter, right? And some of it of course new, right? Okay. But what you want to emphasize on, right, is that the credit only goes as far as to identifying the issues, right, and attempting to put it into the charter. As to whether it really materializes is another issue altogether, right? So AU's record so far has been mixed, right? Do we really see AU functioning as a norm entrepreneur and being able to successfully socialize states into adopting all of these different norms? Answer so far is not really, right? Okay, but at least the logic is that at least it's one step further, right, than what the OAU might have been able to, right? Okay, so basically at least at the minimum, AU has at least instituted the idea of democracy, of accountability, and so on, right? Okay, so what you want to soften the discussion, right, is to is to emphasize on this point, right? It is easy to sit down and criticize and say the AU has not been able to socialize states, or states are still wearing their realist lenses. Fine, it's easy to make that argument, and you should make that argument. But you should also, acknowledge the fact that many states may not have the resources, or they may not be legally bound to implement all of these different recommendations, right? There is moral authority on the part of the AU, right? There is, but having that moral authority is not enough, right? You must have the commitment, of the African states as well as the AU to this new agenda, right? But the state's commitment to these kinds of agenda may be hampered or may be compromised by the state capacity or the capabilities of the state, the resources that are available or at its disposal, the issues that they are otherwise fighting. So it is easy for us to sit down here, right, armchair critic and say, you didn't do this, you didn't do that, you had the opportunity to do it, you had 20 years to settle all of these problems, you've already identified the issues, all you need to do is, take off your realist lenses, wear your liberalist lenses, right, and start to cooperate and think about integration. If you can do it, why can't you? Easy to say that, correct? But you also need to think, I'm sorry to repeat this, you also need to think about the political and policy context, right? And the capacities of the state, right? So the states may not be in a position, right, to be able to allow themselves to be socialized into this either, right? On one hand, you may have the capacities that stand, in their way. On the other hand, right, you may also have reluctance, inertia on the part of the privileged elites, right, who do not want to give up their positions of authority, right? And they are, reverting to things like this is, how we traditionally run the state and so on, right? So think about it, right? Think about it. There may be a generation gap, right? And I think that's actually a good argument to make, right? There's a generation gap, right? How your traditional elites and your older, politicians are approaching state making and the running of say, state management, not state making, sorry, state management, right, and policy making and so on, right, versus the younger group of people who are in these newer organizations, vis-a-vis the older generation, right, of the politicians versus this bottom-up approach of the Agenda 2063 that I mentioned at the beginning of the discussion, right? Okay, all right. So this is how you temper the discussion a little bit. All right. Okay. So I'm not going to run through this slide, right? Because this one is just some statements that you can use. If you're going to summarize certain ideas, if you're going to use them as transitionary paragraph, or if you're going to conclude like the last one, right? It's quite a good statement to use for conclusion, right? AU successes, have come through, military and so political and diplomatic, approaches, and you have seen some successes, but they are not consistently successful. So you could end off your discussion by using a statement like that, right? So some of these you can use for summaries or transition or even conclusion. Okay. All right. So as usual, you've got several different examples, right? So one of them that I picked out was the Libyan conflict, right? They attempted to send a 5% mediation, team, right? And then still not very successful, right? It led to dissent within the AU, right? And it took a very long time before they could recognize the NTC, right? Similarly, right, you've got the Darfur conflict also, right? Not very effective in mitigating the conflict. You have a very poorly equipped mission in Sudan, right? Consisting of just 9,000 troops, mostly from Rwanda and Nigeria and so on, right? And it was so ineffective that basically they required assistance from from UN, right? Which basically resulted in UNAMID. Okay, so in general, what we did see was a mixed response, right? So the AU seems to have stepped up its efforts in responding to a lot of these regional crises, right? But they still eventually ended up behaving very similar to the OAU, particularly when you look at Bashir, all right, in Sudan, right? So what basically happened, when you look at Bashir, right, was when some of these member states, right, 55 of these member states, right, some of them were party to the Rome Statute in the International Criminal Court, right, but Sudan was not party to the International Criminal Court. So basically what happened, is that we will talk about Bashir when we look at ICC, right, in particular, right? But what basically happened was that Sudan, right, didn't want to give up Bashir, even though Bashir had two international arrest warrants on his head, right, for the crisis, for the genocide crisis in Sudan, right? AU basically had urged the member states not to comply with the ICC and actually threatened the member states with sanctions, which was quite surprising, right? So they didn't want to acknowledge, right? And then in 2017 also, right, because this is a long-standing, issue, right? Bashir was running around freely within the African Union. He was also invited, in several, invited to invited to several different AU events, right? Even though he had the 2 arrest warrants on his head, right? In 2017, they also urged states to withdraw those that were party states to the ICC and the Rome Statute, right? They urged states to withdraw from the ICC, and Sudan made this claim, right, that they didn't want to hand over Bashir to ICC, but instead they want to try him in their own domestic courts, right? The rationale was that he was eventually arrested. There was a fall of Bashir subsequently, right? But the rationale is that how strong are your domestic courts? Why would you not want to give him up to the ICC? And this also ties in, right, with Africa. A lot of African states leaders, right, who often argue that the International Criminal Court is not an international criminal court, but it's the African criminal court, because majority of those that they hand out arrest warrants for, or opening investigations into, right, they all tend to be around African states, Ivory Coast, Burundi, Darfur, Congo. Take a look. If you go to the ICC website, which we will look at in lecture 20, if you go to the ICC website, right, you will notice that this is an accusation. So this was actually quite problematic, right, with regards to the Sudanese crisis, right? And it was quite unexpected, right? Despite all of these different normative innovations and claims, that they wanted to uphold democracy, and they wanted to, remember just now we had that clause in the Article 4H, right, in the Constitutive Charter, that says, the union has the right to intervene, right, in any state that is committing genocide, or crimes against humanity of the people. Why was this an exception, right? Why did they not want to cooperate with the ICC? So that remains as a big stumbling block. Okay. All right. The other issue, the other challenge is that it has shifted. The peace and security record has shifted in the wrong directions, right? With the old patterns emerging all over again. So, like I said, right, sounds good on paper, right? But in reality, right, the implementation, right? So formulation, well done. Implementation did not take off. Application did not take off, right? So you've got the same threats of authoritarianism, the same patterns of conflict, returning, right? New threats basically emerging all over again, right? So basically, the idea here is to say, some would make an argument. All right, you may say that these threats have not been mitigated so far, but you haven't really seen something that's occurring, on the same scale as the Rwandan genocide, right? So some would make that argument, right? So it's not the same as the Rwandan genocide. You haven't seen a repeat of that. So but is that really a point to celebrate, right? You still have several other various conflict areas, right? And then the rationale is that whatever measures that they are taking, right, have not been entirely successful, right? So say for example, the regional East African community, right, or neither the Ugandan president, right, were able to make any kind of negotiations, a headway in the negotiations, when they attempted to keep the peace in Somalia, right? And there's a constant rejection of the peacekeepers and so on, right? So states are reverting, right, back to wearing their realist lenses. Our question is that, did they ever really take off their realist lenses or not, right? I think that's the main question out there, right? Okay. AU has been actually very vocal in its condemnation, right, of other assassination attempts, right? They've been quick to highlight, say for example, whatever issues that have occurred elsewhere, even they were even quite vocal in terms of criticism over the George Floyd issue in the US. They even make comments over that, right? But what happens when they are looking at conflicts that are occurring on their own continent, right? So I like that statement that I think I copied it from a video, if I'm not wrong. What is the point of AU, right, when it loses its backbone at the first sight of a dictator? Right, okay. They've got very limp-wristed response. Remember just now I mentioned that third termism to you, right? Basically, you still have a scenario where they endorse leaders, right, who have been in power for several years. Like say for example, Gaddafi had been in power for 40 years, right? Nuema had been in power since 1979, right? The chair of the different chairs, right? That were in um, the chairs of AU, like Abdel Fattah Al Sisi, right? He was hailed as one of the younger chairs of ICC AU, right? Okay. Unfortunately, LCC also, was subject from Egypt, right? Who was also subject to a lot of criticism subsequently. So whether they're young or whether they're old, right? Those that have been at the helm of the AU, right, have not actually painted a very promising, picture, right? The rationale is that how is it that an organization that claims to incorporate all of these different ideas of, upholding democracy, upholding human rights, and so on, why is it that they have then subsequently endorsed leaders, right? Say in the case of not wanting to give up Bashir to the ICC, number one, right? Number two, why have they been endorsing such leaders, right? And why have they been supporting them over the years, right? So that sort of one step forward and then 20 steps backwards, right? It doesn't actually contribute to the effectiveness of the organization, right? Okay, so I think want to reiterate throughout the entire discussion, right? Okay, that they've identified the different issue areas, right? Looks good on paper, it is in the constitutive charter and so on, but they have not been able to act on it, right? So the AU, they've devoted their attention, right, in resolving all of these interstate, intrastate conflicts and so on, right, but have not really been very successful, right, but they've made some inroads, right. They've attempted to expand the peace support operations, right, but the logic is that they require a lot of external assistance, right. So you notice with even the one the mission in Somalia, right? And then also the mission with the Burundi peacekeepers and so on, right? They always have a reliance on external actors, right? Like the UN, for instance, right? So subsequently, what the rationale is that analysts basically say, okay, if you want the peacekeeping forces to actually be effective, right, you should, have two types of peacekeeping forces, right? Number one, you should have, light footprint deployment aimed at conflict prevention, right? So that would come under the capacity building, right? And that would come under troops that you could deploy at the first instance of conflict breaking out, right? Subsequently, you should also have another type of troops, right? That will be able to engage in combat, right? And they'll be able to engage in peace enforcement and peacekeeping. All right. So that would be a more calibrated way to target these kinds of varieties of interstate and intrastate conflict that happen quite frequently, right? In the African continent. Okay. All right. Okay. And then yeah, so this is what I was mentioning earlier on, right? They require intense capacity building, right? Okay, and at the same time, right, remember the logic is that the budgets and the financial constraints that a lot of the African states basically face, right? That's why you require uh, contributions by external agencies. So, like for example, here is proposed, right, that if African states can basically cover 25% of the cost of AU's peace operations, right, then the UN will be able to cover the remaining 75%. So at least there is an attempt, right, to address how can we go about solving this problem, right? But and very importantly, it cannot be a case where it is fully funded by external agencies. So while we do mention, right, that they are already facing extreme financial constraints and capacities that are being constrained, right, as a result of weak institutions or as a result of exogenous factors that are outside of their control. Ownership is important. Remember just now I mentioned the idea of ownership, the stake, right, that they have, right, that will cement responsibility towards it, right? Okay. All right. So, the rationale here also is that I think the last point on this slide is very important, right? So, it is just futile to just spend money on military missions, right? And enhancing, the institutions and so on, or the peacekeeping operations, when you should actually be thinking more about, remember what I mentioned just now, addressing the root structural causes of violence. Sorry, the root causes of structural violence. Sorry, I say wrongly. The root causes of structural violence, right? That should be addressed, right? And you should think more about mediation and the usage of the courts and so on, right? Rather than spending all of this money on just peacekeeping operations and so on, right? Okay. All right. So, basically, what I, highlighted, I've kind of discussed this already. This is just, expansions of the ideas, right? Is that, there must be increased financing, right? There must be, predictability, and there must also be this logic. I think the last point on this slide is actually the one that I really want to emphasize on. There must be sustainable financing for peace operations, right? And, a way to address also very importantly the fallout that arises from these missions, right? So you're definitely going to have civilian casualties. You're definitely going to have people who are experiencing the after effects of things like genocide or crimes against humanity, right? So there must be other programs that look at the aftercare, right, of these citizens who have been experiencing all of this fallout. Citizens who have been disadvantaged by their own states, right? Okay, we will talk a little bit about this when we talk about ICTR and ICTY, right? When we look at the Rwandan genocide. So it's slightly linked, all right? But I just want you to think about that point, okay? All right. So the main, challenges, right? Moving, to the last part, right? Basically, right? They really need to think a bit more carefully about how to put, Africa back on its track, right? Okay. And very importantly, they need to think about how to address other root causes of weak governance, right? Which is looking at those in power who are attempting to just hang on to power. Think about how to address armed conflict, right? How to address this civil conflict that arises from competition by these various groups for scarce resources, right? So they're talking about the third termism and so on. And if they do that, then that would mitigate the spillover from the civil conflicts and the intra-state crisis that a lot of these states, basically, face. All right, okay. All right, so this is just basically the summary, right? Okay, this is what I was telling you just now, right? So they had been quick, to talk about human rights crisis elsewhere, right? Say for example, when they look at the African diaspora, right, or when they look at the treatment of Africans, outside of the continent, right? So basically, they voiced concerns over George Floyd. They talked about the treatment of Africans in PRC, in Guangzhou, and so on, right? But they have not been, it's like when you point a finger outside, the remaining four fingers are pointing back at you, right? That's basically some of the examples down there, right? They did not, respond to, HR, human rights violations, right? In South Africa, which was quite sad. Under the guise of implementing your COVID-19 lockdown rules, you just, sidestep the human rights violations altogether, right? It's remained quite passive, right, in its response, to others, right? Now that this one that I was telling you, LCC, but the fourth bullet point, it remained silent when Egypt's, Abdel Fattah LCC, right, ordered your tyrannical crackdowns on anti-government protests, right? LCC, was the chair of AU, right, in 2019, right? So how can you just sit down there and not comment or not say anything, right? Okay, so that's basically the idea down here, right, that you want to emphasize on. All right, so this is what I was telling you. All right, this is taken from Crisis Group International. It just gives you a summary, all right, of the different areas, right, where the problems that the AU is facing. Sorry, problems that Africa is facing, right, in light of the crisis, in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, right, and how existing crises have been put on the back burners, right, or in some cases they have been emphasized as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, right. So these are the 8 areas which Crisis Group International identified, for the AU to continue working on, right. Okay, so I pulled it out from the article because I wanted to give you a quick summary, right. I didn't link the article. If you want, I can upload the article for you. I can PDF it and upload it for you, right, into eGlobal, right? This is one of the newer articles, right? So basically, what the emphasis of these 8 areas is that the AU can have make inroads in these different areas in the coming year, right? But this is something that I think you need to take with a pinch of salt, because it is not going to be easy for them to basically address all of these different issues and different conflicts, right? Because they have already been, their response efforts, right, are actually compounded by fewer resources, right? They have experienced disrupted funding cycles, right? They basically have to deal with the lack of vaccines and the impact that it subsequently has had on the healthcare sector, right, in Africa as well, right? So these become extremely critical, right? It remains to be seen how basically they are going to be able to handle it, right? Last two slides basically, okay, these are the video resources. Last slide, right, basically gives you a quick comparison, right, between the OAU and the AU, which I've summarized for you. Okay, all right. So yeah, I know we've got a lot of material to deal with, right, in a terrain that's not entirely familiar, right? Let me do this, right? Let me link that article for you, the crisis group article. I will PDF it and upload it for you into the eGlobal, right? And let me give you maybe a quick note, like a very short note relating to like an overall, idea about the institutional effects of the AU, right? That will help to tie whatever loose ends together, all right? But more importantly, all right, what I want you to remember when you are discussing any of these arguments, right, is to make an emphasis on the points that I emphasized today, right? The idea of the political and policy context, the idea of things that look good on paper but not in practicality. Number two. Number three, right, what you also need to pay attention to is the softer, gentler, kinder approach, because of looking at the logic of the capacities that are already negatively affected as a result of existing issues in Africa, right? So the various socio-developmental challenges that it faces, and how that compromises or hampers, right, states' commitment to the practices and principles, how that also then subsequently affects, right, the AU's ability to respond, right? These are the four main points. Whatever else in the 35 slides that we have, right, all of the other details, right, those largely are the content, the examples, right? So know which are the examples that are key to pick up, right? Because there are a lot of examples, there's a lot of detail, right, that is involved, right? So know where to streamline, know where to emphasize these main analytical points. Okay. All right. Next week, we will do ICTY, ICTR. One of my favorite ICTY, ICTR, ICC. Actually, two of my favorite chapters. The two of my favorite lectures in the entire course, right? Because there's a lot of interesting material to deal with, and it deals with the genocide and so on, right? So that will be far more interesting rather than the last two lectures that we had. Okay, all right. Sorry I overshot, but we finished. Okay, all right. So I will see you all next week. Okay, bye bye, bye bye, bye bye.